Welcome to the war narrative where wars become stories. If someone asked you what the deadliest war in American history was, you might think it was World War II. After all, we see lots of pictures from places like Normandy and Iwo Jima, and we remember the atomic bomb. Other people might guess the Vietnam War because there were so many sad news reports showing soldiers coming home. But both of these answers would be wrong. The war that killed the most Americans by far was the Civil War. This was a war fought right here in America, in our own fields, towns, and near our rivers. More than 620,000 soldiers died between 1861 and 1865. This number was bigger than all the Americans who died in every other war combined, at least until the middle of the 1900s. Here's how terrible it was. America only had about 31 million people back then. By the end of the war, 8 out of every 100 American men had died. Every town, every family, and every church had empty seats where people used to sit. The war touched people's homes in a way that no war fought in another country ever could. But strangely, many people today forget this fact. Most people think of World War II as the big war, while the Civil War is remembered more for its politics than for how many people died. But for the people who lived through it, the Civil War was like the end of the world. It destroyed dreams of a quick victory. It turned beautiful farmland into empty, damaged land. And it showed Americans a new kind of warfare where machines could kill huge numbers of people, which shocked even the soldiers themselves. What makes this even more surprising is that the Civil War happened before machine guns as we know them were invented. There were no tanks, no airplanes, and no powerful explosives like we have today. At first, the battles look old-fashioned. You see men standing in lines, flags waving, and soldiers on horses charging. But underneath this old-looking warfare, something new was happening. New weapons were running into old ways of fighting. This crash between new and old created huge numbers of deaths that neither the North nor the South understood until it was too late. But the story of death in the Civil War isn't just about bullets and cannonballs. Actually, most men didn't die from fighting at all. Disease killed far more people than battles did. Sicknesses like measles, dysentery, and smallpox spread through the army camps, killing soldiers before they ever fought in a battle. The camps became places where germs spread easily, and something as simple as drinking from the wrong stream could kill a man. This combination of disease, better weapons, and old-fashioned battle plans created the perfect storm. To understand why the Civil War became America's deadliest war, we need to look closer at what life was like for the men who fought in it. There were young farm boys suddenly packed into dirty camps where germs spread easily. There were new rifles and bullets that broke bones like glass. There were big cannons that could destroy entire groups of soldiers. And there were commanders who kept using old battle tactics even as warfare was changing around them. The cost wasn't just measured in numbers, even though the numbers are huge. It was measured in the quiet of small towns that had lost half their sons. It was measured in mothers holding letters with black borders that told them their sons were dead. It was measured in veterans coming home on crutches or never coming home at all. The Civil War's legacy isn't just that it kept the Union together or ended slavery. It's also that it introduced Americans to modern warfare, where human lives could be destroyed on a huge scale, like in a factory. This is the story of why the American Civil War became the bloodiest time in our nation's history. And it begins not with the sound of guns firing, but with the invisible armies of disease that marched with every group of soldiers. When we think of war, we imagine bullets and swords, smoke from cannons, and soldiers on horses charging. But in the American Civil War, the biggest killer wasn't gunfire or cannons. It was disease. About 2/3 of all Civil War deaths were caused not by fighting, but by sickness. That means for every soldier who died in battle, 2 more died from being sick. They wasted away in hospital tents or on the muddy ground of camps, burning with fever and confused. The reasons were sadly simple. Hundreds of thousands of young men, many from farms who had never traveled far from home, suddenly found themselves crowded together in huge camps. They carried germs that others had never been exposed to. What might have been a mild childhood sickness for one person could sweep through an entire group of soldiers and kill many of them. Measles, smallpox, typhoid, dysentery, and pneumonia became as scary as enemy gunfire. Dysentery alone, which causes terrible stomach problems, killed more men than all the bullets at the Battle of Gettysburg combined. The camps were very dirty. Soldiers often went to the bathroom in shallow holes dug too close to where they lived or upstream from where they got their drinking water. Dead animal bodies, poorly buried waste, and pools of still water became places where germs grew. Many medical officers who were trained before people understood germs didn't know how diseases spread. They gave soldiers pills made with mercury, took their blood out, or gave them alcohol instead of giving them fresh water, rest, and cleanliness. The treatments often made sick men feel worse. The conditions inside the temporary hospitals were just as bad. Long rows of beds were crammed into drafty barns or tents where you could hear men groaning all night. Arms and legs were cut off on wooden tables with blood pooling on the floor. The surgeon would move from one patient to the next without really cleaning his saw. Infections spread almost every time. Soldiers were as afraid of the word hospital as they were of the word charge. But even with all this suffering, there were moments of strength. Soldiers tried to make their own cures, like tea made from pine needles to prevent scurvy, and bandages torn from shirts. Women volunteers from groups like the North's United States Sanitary Commission and from countless southern towns brought food, clean sheets, and comfort to sick soldiers. These early efforts were the beginning of modern battlefield nursing and health improvements that came after the war. Disease did more than just kill people. It changed battle plans. At a place called Chancellorsville, for example, nearly 5,000 Confederate soldiers were too sick to fight because of dirty water. Entire groups of soldiers disappeared, not from rifle fire, but from fever. Commanders had to change their battle plans based not just on how strong the enemy was, but on whether their own men were still healthy enough to stand. For soldiers, the fear of disease was constant and personal. You could avoid a bullet, but you couldn't run away from invisible germs. Letters sent home are filled with prayers to stay healthy, prayers against fever, and descriptions of friends dying beside them. To many soldiers, the Civil War seemed less like a battle between armies and more like a lottery of survival, where drinking from the wrong well or hearing someone cough at night might decide if you lived or died. Even before the first shots were fired, disease made sure the Civil War would be the most deadly war America had ever known. And as the fighting got worse, the battlefield itself brought new horrors. None was more terrible than the bullet that defined this war: the mini-ball. If disease was the silent killer of the Civil War, the mini-ball was its brutal executioner. Named after a French army officer named Claude Mini, this cone-shaped bullet seemed like a small change at first. But it changed warfare forever. Before it was invented, muskets fired round balls that were slow to reload and very hard to aim. A soldier's survival often depended less on his aim and more on luck and how close he was to the enemy. But with the mini-ball, everything changed. The bullet's hollow bottom allowed it to expand when fired, gripping the spiral grooves inside the musket barrel. This gave the bullet a deadly spin, making it much more accurate and able to travel farther. Suddenly, soldiers who could barely hit a man at 50 yards away could now reliably hit targets over 200 yards away. And because of its shape, the mini-ball was faster to load, which meant a group of soldiers could fire shot after shot at an advancing enemy with terrifying speed. But the true horror of the mini-ball wasn't just in how accurate it was, but in the wounds it caused. Unlike the musket balls from earlier wars, which often went cleanly through flesh, the mini-ball's heavy, slow-moving impact shattered bones like glass and tore jagged paths through muscles. Arms and legs that were hit could rarely be saved. Field surgeons, who didn't have the tools or knowledge to fix shattered bones, often had to cut off limbs as the only choice. The sight of men missing arms and legs became sadly common in America after the war. One Confederate soldier said it plainly: "A man hit by a mini-ball might as well be struck by a cannon." Another Union doctor wrote that the bullet left wounds so destructive that nothing can be done but the knife. The pain didn't end on the battlefield. Infections started quickly. The smell of gangrene, which is rotting flesh, filled hospitals, and men prayed for sleeping medicine or chloroform before the saw touched their body. But even as the mini-ball caused more deaths, it also made the battlefield more equal. Killing was no longer limited to expert shooters or hidden cannons. Every soldier, even a farm boy who barely knew how to use a musket, now had a weapon that could kill with deadly accuracy. This new reality forced armies to face a problem. While the tools of war had gotten better, the tactics stayed stuck in the past. Officers still ordered their men to stand in straight lines, shoulder to shoulder, as if they were fighting in the days of Napoleon. Against the mini-ball, these formations became nothing more than rows of targets. The bullet became more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of a world caught between two time periods. A weapon designed in the age of science and factories, but used within a military system still following 18th century rules. That clash would turn ordinary battlefields into places of horrible death. And as deadly as the mini-ball was, it wasn't the only terror soldiers faced. Behind the lines, shaking the very ground with its thunder, came the cannons. The mini-ball alone didn't make the Civil War so deadly. It was its partnership with the rifled musket that turned killing into something done on a factory scale. Before the 1850s, smoothbore muskets were the standard weapon for foot soldiers. They were quick to load but wildly inaccurate beyond 50 yards. A group of shots fired at 100 yards often hit more dirt than soldiers. Armies relied on lots of guns firing at once and charging with bayonets to break an enemy line because only large numbers could overcome the musket's problems. Rifled muskets changed everything. By carving spiral grooves into the inside of the barrel, a bullet could spin as it left the gun, making its flight steady. The mini-ball fit perfectly into this system. Now a line of soldiers could fire accurate shots hundreds of yards away, thinning out enemy ranks long before bayonets ever clashed. For soldiers, this meant stepping onto a battlefield where death could reach them from distances their fathers could never have imagined. A farmer-turned-soldier who once hunted deer up close suddenly found himself holding a weapon that could kill a man farther away than he could clearly see. The range of killing got bigger. The safe areas of older wars simply disappeared. This change had effects on soldiers' minds. In earlier wars, battle was a loud, up-close event. Smoke was thick, you could see enemy faces, and steel met steel. In the Civil War, a man could fall without ever seeing who shot at him. A sniper hidden behind trees could strike down an officer across a river. Union General John Sedgwick, who joked that they couldn't hit an elephant at this distance, was killed moments later by a Confederate sniper's mini-ball. The combination of rifled muskets and mini-balls made the old dream of glory through brave charges into a nightmare. Lines of blue or gray soldiers marched forward with flags waving, only to collapse before unseen rifles. The courage of the soldier mattered less than the cold math of range, how fast you could reload, and having cover. But the musket wasn't the only tool of destruction improved by rifling. Cannons also went through their own revolution, extending death even farther across the battlefield. When these new rifled cannons unleashed their thunder, entire formations of soldiers could vanish in smoke and iron. The Civil War wasn't just a fight between men and ideas. It was a testing ground for modern killing. If the rifled musket made the battlefield deadlier at long range, artillery made it like the end of the world. By the mid-1800s, cannons were no longer the crude, short-range weapons of earlier wars. Improvements in making metal and rifling meant guns could fire farther, more accurately, and with devastating new types of ammunition. The Civil War became a testing ground for this technology, and the results were terrible. Field artillery came in many forms: smoothbore Napoleons, rifled Parrott guns, and the fearsome 3-inch ordnance rifle. Each had its job, but all shared one purpose: to hurl destruction at the enemy. Canister shot turned a cannon into a giant shotgun, spewing hundreds of iron balls that shredded charging lines of soldiers at close range. Explosive shells, timed to burst in the air, rained sharp metal pieces down on soldiers huddled behind fences or in shallow ditches. A well-aimed strike could wipe out an entire company in seconds. And unlike musket fire, artillery's terror affected everyone. Soldiers in battle described the sound of shells screaming overhead, the unnatural shriek of iron spinning through the air. Some men froze at the sound, unable to move. Others forced themselves forward, knowing that any step could be their last. Tree branches snapped, fences were destroyed, and bodies were torn apart with horrifying suddenness. One Confederate soldier remembered that there was no time to pray, only to shiver and wait. Artillery also changed landscapes. Hillsides were stripped bare of trees, their trunks shattered by cannonballs. Farmhouses and barns became piles of rubble within minutes of bombardment. The soil itself seemed to explode, with plumes of earth rising skyward before collapsing into craters. At major battles like Shiloh, Antietam, and Gettysburg, the earth was so churned up by shells that survivors described the ground as looking like it had been plowed by giants. But beyond the physical damage, artillery caused deep mental wounds. Foot soldiers dreaded charges across open fields, not only because of musket fire, but because they could hear the cannons already being loaded, feel the ground shake, and see distant flashes announcing death's arrival. The wait before bombardment, hours of waiting while shells howled overhead, could break a group's courage long before bayonets clashed. Commanders understood the power of artillery and increasingly relied on it to prepare attacks or break defenses. But they often underestimated how it affected morale. A line of soldiers might withstand volleys of musket fire, but long shelling wore down discipline, leaving men hollow-eyed and shaking. The thunder of war echoed not only in their ears but in their memories, haunting them long after the guns fell silent. For both Union and Confederate soldiers, artillery symbolized the factory-like scale of the Civil War, a force of destruction that was impersonal and impossible to escape. And through their letters and diaries, they left behind chilling testimonies of what it felt like to stand under that storm of iron. Numbers and technology can only tell part of the story. To truly understand the terror of Civil War artillery, we must turn to the words of those who lived through it. Soldiers, officers, and even regular people wrote down their memories in letters, diaries, and newspapers, leaving behind a collection of voices that echo across the years. Sergeant Jonathan Stowe of the 15th Massachusetts Infantry recalled one barrage with words that sound almost like poetry. Shells fly past me every few seconds, carrying away branches from trees and scattering limbs around. I am in severe pain, furious how the shells fly. I do sincerely hope I shall not be wounded again. His words capture not only the physical danger but the unbearable tension. Waiting for the next shriek, the next explosion, knowing it could land beside you. Others remembered the strange contrast between beauty and destruction. A Confederate soldier described cannon fire at dusk as arches of flame cutting the sky, almost heavenly, until the shells burst, tearing men apart. One Union soldier admitted that the bursts of fire on the horizon looked like a city ablaze. But as the smoke cleared, he realized the glow came from farmhouses that were shattered and burning. For regular people, the war sometimes came to their doorsteps. Families living near Gettysburg or Spotsylvania huddled in basements while windows rattled from the force of artillery. Mothers held children to their chests as glass shattered around them. Some came out after days underground to find their fields full of craters, fences torn down, and fruit trees reduced to splinters. The war didn't politely keep its distance. It invaded the very soil of America. Letters home reveal another layer: the struggle to describe something that can't be described. Soldiers frequently apologized to parents or loved ones for what they wrote, fearing that their words couldn't possibly capture the reality. It is impossible, one young man admitted, to write how it feels to hear the screaming of shells. You must only imagine that hell itself had broken loose. These testimonies remind us that beyond the strategy and statistics were human beings trying to put horror into sentences. Yet for all the fear, there was also grim determination. Some soldiers admitted that once the barrage began, numbness set in. The mind, overwhelmed, accepted death as inevitable. Others prayed feverishly or sang hymns, their voices trembling under the roar. One Confederate captain wrote that during a particularly savage shelling, his men recited the Lord's Prayer aloud together, each line nearly drowned out by the blasts. These personal testimonies strip away the abstractions of history. They remind us that artillery wasn't simply a weapon of war but an experience. One that blended sound, light, terror, and acceptance into something unforgettable. And while the cannon spoke with factory-like fury, the way armies fought on the ground revealed an equally tragic mismatch. Old tactics colliding with new realities. The American Civil War was in many ways a clash between centuries. On one side stood weapons born of the industrial age, rifled muskets, mini-balls, and rifled artillery. On the other stood tactics rooted in an earlier time when armies moved like machines and glory was measured by how steady a line remained. The result was slaughter on an unprecedented scale. Most of the war's leading generals graduated from West Point, where they learned Napoleonic doctrine. They had studied the campaigns of Austerlitz and Waterloo, where columns and lines of men advanced shoulder to shoulder with flags flying and drums beating. Such formations had once worked well. Their thunderous volleys were decisive on smoky fields where smoothbore muskets could barely hit a target beyond 50 yards. But by the 1860s, those tactics were outdated and deadly. Yet tradition carried huge weight. Military honor was tied to discipline in the open, not hiding behind rocks or trees. Commanders feared that looser, more spread-out formations would turn into chaos or cowardice. And so, battle after battle, they ordered men to march in long lines across fields swept by rifled fire. To stand firm in formation was seen as noble. To break for cover was seen as weakness. In the face of modern firepower, such ideals became a death sentence. At places like Fredericksburg, entire Union brigades marched again and again into a storm of Confederate fire, only to be cut down before reaching the enemy lines. At Cold Harbor, Union soldiers pinned slips of paper with their names onto their coats so their bodies could be identified, fully aware they were marching to their deaths. Still, the orders came and still the lines advanced. The horror wasn't lost on the men themselves. Letters speak of soldiers watching comrades fall in neat rows as though cut down by an invisible blade. Survivors often expressed bitter disbelief. Why had their leaders stuck to tactics so obviously wrong for the weapons at hand? Part of the answer lies in resistance to change. Armies are conservative institutions, slow to change. Another part lies in the chaos of a rapidly expanding war. Both North and South had grown their armies with volunteers and newly appointed officers, many of whom had little or no experience. Without time to train men in new tactics, commanders often went back to the familiar drills of Napoleonic warfare. The tragic irony is that even as soldiers adapted instinctively, dropping to the ground, firing from behind fences, digging shallow pits, their superiors often still insisted on the old ways. It would take years of bloodshed and a generation of loss before military thinking began to shift toward more spread-out formations and dug-in positions. The Civil War thus became not only a struggle over the fate of the Union but a brutal classroom in which America learned at terrible cost that the future of warfare would no longer be written in neat straight lines. And making this tragedy worse was the fact that many of the generals giving orders weren't seasoned tacticians at all, but political appointees. Men elevated more for connections than competence. The Civil War was fought not only with bullets and cannon fire but also with egos, reputations, and political maneuvering. At the war's start, the United States had only a small professional army. When war broke out, both the Union and the Confederacy had to expand their officer ranks incredibly fast. Into that void stepped men of wildly varying talent. Some were veterans of the Mexican War, others were promoted for loyalty, ambition, or pure political convenience. The backbone of command came from West Point. Nearly every major battle of the war featured graduates of the Academy on both sides. Men like Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, William Tecumseh Sherman, and Stonewall Jackson. These officers brought with them the discipline of professional training, the shared textbooks and lectures of their youth, and a common way of thinking about strategy. They had drilled together on the Hudson River, studied the same campaigns, and carried a sense of brotherhood into a war that now set them against one another. But surrounding these professionals was a swirl of political generals. Men appointed because of their connections, influence, or ability to raise troops. For the Union, this was especially common as President Lincoln faced the delicate task of holding together a divided coalition of northern states. To secure support from immigrant communities, he appointed men like Franz Sigel, a German revolutionary whose command skills often failed to match his reputation among German-American voters. Others, such as Nathaniel Banks and Benjamin Butler, owed their stars more to political service than to battlefield competence. The Confederacy wasn't immune to this phenomenon. Though smaller and more military in culture, it too elevated men of local influence who lacked significant military experience. In both armies, the clash between professional officers and political appointees created tension, miscommunication, and at times disaster. A regiment might fight bravely only to be wasted by the blunders of its commander. For the soldiers who bore the brunt of these decisions, the results could be devastating. Letters home often mention frustration with leaders who seemed blind to the realities of the battlefield. Union privates cursed generals who ordered suicidal assaults. Confederate soldiers complained about missed opportunities because of hesitation or mismanagement at the top. The rank and file understood all too well that their lives were often balanced on the judgment or foolishness of the men in charge. And yet leadership wasn't simply about skill. It was also about inspiration, about the ability to hold an army together when hunger bit and fear threatened to break their lines. Here, men like Lee and Grant proved invaluable. Lee's calm authority and devotion to Virginia inspired loyalty even in defeat. Grant's quiet determination, what Lincoln called his refusal to whine or make excuses, gave the Union Army a steady hand when others faltered. The Civil War thus revealed two competing realities of command: the professionalism of men trained at West Point and the instability of leaders chosen for politics. The mixture was explosive, and on the battlefield, it often meant the difference between victory and disaster. Still, even the most gifted general couldn't always protect his men from the storm of modern firepower. And when the land offered cover, desperate soldiers clung to it, defying the old doctrines in a bid to survive. Despite the stubborn commitment to Napoleonic doctrine, the chaos of the battlefield often forced soldiers and officers alike to improvise. The idea of bravely standing shoulder to shoulder in open fields quickly gave way to a simpler truth: cover meant survival. When rocks, trees, or walls were available, men instinctively dropped behind them, creating makeshift defenses even as their generals urged them forward. At Antietam in 1862, this instinct took on legendary form. The Union Army under General Burnside attempted to cross a narrow stone bridge over Antietam Creek. On the opposite bank, a mere 500 Confederate defenders hunkered behind trees, fences, and rocks. Hidden from view, they unleashed withering fire on brigade after brigade of Union soldiers. The attackers, trapped on the exposed bridge and riverbanks, fell in heaps. It took hours and thousands of deaths before Burnside's men finally forced a crossing. To this day, that small span of stone is remembered as Burnside's Bridge, a symbol of how cover and terrain could give a handful of defenders the power to halt an army. Examples like this were scattered across the war. At Fredericksburg, Confederate troops dug into a sunken road behind a stone wall. As Union lines advanced across open ground, the defenders fired with near impunity, mowing them down in waves. It was not war, one Union survivor wrote. It was murder. The landscape itself had become a weapon, amplifying the deadliness of rifled muskets. These scenes foreshadowed the trench warfare that would dominate Europe half a century later. Even when commanders resisted, soldiers themselves carved shallow rifle pits or piled up fence rails for protection. The ground became scarred with improvised defenses, the first hints of a new style of war where the earth itself was enlisted as an ally. Regular people noticed the transformation too. Farmers returned to find their fields pocked with ditches and mounds, their fences torn down to build barriers. Fruit orchards were stripped bare not just by artillery but by desperate men seeking firewood or cover. The American landscape, once a backdrop for rolling farms and quiet towns, was reshaped into a theater of death and survival. The lesson was clear to those who lived it. The days of rigid lines and open fields were numbered. But tragically, this realization came only after countless lives had already been lost. And nowhere was the futility of old tactics in the face of modern firepower more painfully displayed than in the rolling fields of Gettysburg, where Robert E. Lee ordered one of the most infamous charges in American history. By the summer of 1863, the war had already claimed tens of thousands of lives. But it was at Gettysburg that the brutality of modern weapons against outdated tactics reached its grim peak. For 3 days, Union and Confederate forces clashed across the fields and ridges of southern Pennsylvania in what would become the largest battle ever fought on American soil. More than 160,000 men stood in arms. By the time the smoke cleared, over 50,000 were dead, wounded, or missing. On the third day of battle, General Robert E. Lee made a fateful decision. Convinced that Union lines had been weakened after 2 days of fighting, he ordered an assault meant to shatter the center of the enemy position on Cemetery Ridge. The plan called for nearly 12,500 Confederate soldiers to advance across open farmland, 3/4 of a mile of flat, exposed ground straight into the heart of Union defenses. It would become known as Pickett's Charge. The attack began with a thunderous Confederate artillery barrage, the largest of the war. For 2 hours, cannons thundered, their smoke covering the fields and rattling the windows of houses miles away. Regular people later said the ground shook as though an earthquake had hit. Lee hoped the barrage would break Union defenses or at least weaken them enough for the infantry to punch through. When the cannons fell silent, the gray lines formed. Men under George Pickett, along with divisions led by Pettigrew and Trimble, lined up in near-perfect rows. Flags lifted, drums beat, and the order came. They stepped forward into history. The march across that field was slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial at first. Union soldiers watched from the ridge as the gray waves rolled toward them, sunlight glinting off bayonets. It was a sight of terrible grandeur. Thousands moving as one, banners swaying, officers riding on horseback. But grandeur quickly gave way to horror. The Union artillery opened fire. Shells burst among the advancing Confederates, tearing gaps in the lines. Men fell screaming. Flags dropped. Yet the survivors closed ranks and pressed forward. Then came the musket fire. From behind stone walls and fences, Union infantry unleashed a storm of mini balls. Each volley cut huge sections through the Confederate ranks. Still they advanced, a mile-long column trudging through smoke and fire. Some Confederates did reach the Union lines. In desperate hand-to-hand combat, they thrust bayonets and swung rifle butts, breaking through the stone wall in places. But the numbers were against them. Reinforcements poured into the Union center, and the Confederate attack crumbled under the weight of relentless fire. By the time the survivors staggered back across that bloody field, more than 6,000 Confederate soldiers had fallen in less than an hour. Entire regiments were reduced to fragments. Lee, watching from a distance, is said to have murmured, "It is all my fault." For many historians, Pickett's charge marked the high-water mark of the Confederacy, the moment when its grand hopes crested before breaking on the rock of Union resolve. The scene at Gettysburg revealed the full futility of marrying Napoleonic tactics to 19th-century firepower. And it wasn't only the scale of deaths that burned itself into memory, but also the deafening roar that came before them. A bombardment so huge it was said to be the loudest sound ever heard in North America up to that point. The assault across Gettysburg's fields was more than just a military maneuver. It was a human drama played out step by agonizing step. Survivors recalled the oppressive July heat, the sharp smoke hanging over the fields, and the eerie silence just before the order to advance. Then came the long march forward, where each man knew that survival was as uncertain as flipping a coin. The Confederates advanced in perfect lines, officers urging their men to keep step despite the growing storm. To onlookers, it seemed impossible that such discipline could hold under fire. Union artillery found its range quickly. Shells burst in the midst of the gray ranks, sending men and banners tumbling into the grass. Still, the survivors closed ranks, stepping over the fallen, determined to carry their flags forward. As the Confederates drew closer, the true horror unfolded. Union rifles loaded with mini-balls tore through their formations with precision. The sound was described as a continuous ripping of cloth, volley after volley tearing holes in the advancing tide. Survivors remembered the air filled not just with smoke, but with the screams of the wounded, calling out for water, for help, for their mothers. Yet still they came. One Union soldier later wrote that the sight inspired both awe and pity. It was magnificent. It was war in its grandest form, and it was murder. The Confederate soldiers pressed through fences, over rail lines, and across open fields littered with the fallen. By the time they reached the Union stone wall, their numbers had been cut nearly in half. The clash at the wall was savage. Bayonets thrust, musket butts swung, and men grappled in desperate hand-to-hand combat. For a fleeting moment, Confederate flags waved atop the wall, and it seemed as though the charge might succeed. But Union reinforcements surged forward, pouring fire into the breach. The Confederate wave, so orderly at the start, dissolved into fragments of companies, then into scattered survivors. General George Pickett, whose division gave the charge its name, wasn't at the front but waiting to rally his men. When the survivors stumbled back, bloodied and broken, one officer told him his division had been wiped out. Pickett, stunned, could only repeat, "General, I have no division." The cost was staggering. Over 6,000 casualties in less than an hour. Whole units ceased to exist. Friends marched side by side only to see one another fall within feet. For the Confederacy, the charge represented both incredible bravery and irreversible loss. For the Union, it was proof that their lines could hold, that their artillery and rifles could push back even the most determined assault. Pickett's charge entered legend as both a symbol of Southern gallantry and of the tragic futility of outdated tactics. It was the Civil War distilled into a single event. Courage colliding with technology, tradition shattered by industrial firepower. And if the rifles cut down men with deadly precision, it was the artillery barrage that set the stage, shaking the earth with a fury unmatched in North America until the 20th century. Before Pickett's men ever set foot on the field, the earth shook under one of the most ferocious bombardments of the 19th century. At Gettysburg on July 3, 1863, Confederate artillery unleashed a cannonade designed to pulverize Union lines and soften them for the charge to come. Over 150 Confederate guns fired in unison, their thunder rolling across the Pennsylvania countryside in waves. Witnesses compared the sound to continuous thunder, louder and longer lasting than any storm. Union artillery responded with equal fury, and soon the sky was alive with shrieking shells and billowing smoke. The air grew thick with the sharp smell of gunpowder, while flashes of orange fire pierced the haze. For 2 hours, the bombardment raged, deafening soldiers who crouched behind stone walls and splitting trees into jagged pieces. To many, it felt as though the heavens themselves had opened in wrath. Historians have since called this barrage the loudest man-made sound on the North American continent until the explosion of the first atomic bomb in 1945. Imagine the psychological impact. Thousands of men pinned to the earth, unable to act, their ears ringing, their nerves frayed by the endless percussion of exploding shells. Horses panicked and ran away, wagons overturned, and entire batteries of cannons were silenced as their gunners were torn apart. And yet, for all its fury, the Confederate bombardment failed in its purpose. Much of the fire overshot the Union positions, striking empty fields or rear areas. The Union artillery, by contrast, saved its strength and responded with deadly accuracy once the charge began. Confederate soldiers who had huddled with confidence during the barrage rose to advance only to discover that the Union lines were far from broken. For those who endured it, the artillery wasn't just destructive, it was disorienting. Colonel Joseph Mayo of the 3rd Virginia Infantry described the moment when the shells found their range. The first shot or two flew harmlessly overhead, but soon they began to get the range, and then came pandemonium. There was an explosion on the top of a tree, then another, followed by piercing shrieks. 2 men were killed outright, 3 frightfully wounded. Our company suffered terribly. His words convey the surreal mix of awe and horror, of watching nature itself explode into fragments of iron and wood. The bombardment at Gettysburg was a grim preview of the wars to come. The mechanized thunder that shook those fields would echo half a century later in the trenches of the Western Front, when artillery fire would become the main killer of World War I. But for the men in 1863, there was no precedent. They were the first Americans to experience the battlefield transformed into a vast roaring machine. And yet, even amid that chaos, voices survived. Diaries, letters, and memories that captured the human experience of enduring such storms. Their words remind us that beyond statistics and strategy, the Civil War was lived moment by moment under fire, with death all around. If the artillery barrage was the opening to Pickett's charge, the testimonies of the men who endured it provide the human notes of fear, resilience, and disbelief. Their words carry us into the smoke and thunder more vividly than any statistic ever could. Colonel Joseph Mayo, writing from the shattered ranks of the 3rd Virginia Infantry, remembered the eerie rhythm of shells overhead, the first harmless bursts, the growing accuracy, and then pandemonium. His account tells of branches torn from trees, piercing shrieks, and comrades cut down in an instant. In his company alone, 2 killed outright, 3 mangled. For him, the battlefield was no orderly clash of arms but a storm of iron and fire that reduced disciplined ranks to fragments of men clinging to survival. Other voices echoed his despair. A Union gunner described watching Confederate lines stagger under his battery's fire. "We could see them reel and waver, then close up, then reel again. Still they came." His words convey both the deadly efficiency of Union defenses and a kind of horrified respect for the determination of the enemy. Private diaries reveal the psychological torment behind the statistics. One Confederate soldier admitted he couldn't lift his rifle during the charge, his arms trembling too violently. Another Union private crouched behind the stone wall on Cemetery Ridge wrote that he fired mechanically, without aiming, without thinking, only firing. And still they came. Both accounts lay bare the human cost of what military textbooks might call contact with the enemy. For some, faith became a refuge. Soldiers on both sides called on God's will in their letters home, framing survival or death as providence rather than chance. Hymns were sung as men marched into fire. Psalms were whispered as shells shrieked overhead. Religion offered a language for the indescribable, a way to make sense of the randomness of survival. Yet even amid such devastation, men noticed details that revealed their humanity. One Union soldier recalled seeing a Confederate flag rise briefly above the stone wall before toppling into the smoke, a fleeting symbol of courage extinguished. Another Confederate remembered glancing sideways mid-charge and realizing his boyhood friend marching just a yard away was suddenly gone, vanished into the chaos. These voices remind us that Gettysburg wasn't just strategy and numbers but lived experience. Men choking on powder smoke, deafened by explosions, hearts pounding as they fought for their lives. Their words bridged the gap between past and present, allowing us to hear the battlefield through their ears, to see it through their eyes. But out of these memories also came a lesson, slowly learned and bitterly paid for. Traditional tactics could no longer stand against industrial weapons. And as the war dragged on, both Union and Confederate commanders would finally adapt, embracing earthworks and trenches in a desperate attempt to shield their men from annihilation. By 1864, the truth was undeniable. Open field charges, once celebrated as the peak of battlefield courage, had become nothing more than mass executions. The appalling losses at Fredericksburg, Gettysburg, and Cold Harbor forced even the most stubborn commanders to reconsider how they fought. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the Civil War began to shift away from Napoleonic pageantry and toward something darker and more modern: trench warfare. Nowhere was this transition more evident than at the Siege of Petersburg. What began as an attempt by Union forces under General Grant to capture the city quickly turned into a stalemate. Both sides dug into the earth, building networks of trenches, rifle pits, and earthworks that stretched for miles. Soldiers huddled in muddy ditches, their lives measured not in heroic charges, but in the endurance to withstand shellfire, hunger, and disease. For the men in those trenches, the war became a test of wearing each other down. Nights were filled with the crack of sharpshooters and the hiss of shells. Days dragged on with little movement, only the endless labor of fixing defenses. Letters from the front described the boredom interrupted by terror, the sudden scream of artillery, the collapse of a trench wall burying comrades alive, the endless rain turning the ground into a swamp of filth. Petersburg, new technologies made their debut. Union forces experimented with tunneling beneath Confederate lines, leading to the infamous Battle of the Crater, where explosives created a huge pit that swallowed soldiers by the hundreds. But poor planning turned opportunity into disaster as Union troops stumbled into the very hole their engineers had created, where Confederate counterattacks trapped and killed them. It was a grim preview of the terrible learning curve that industrial warfare demanded. Both North and South also began to recognize the value of prepared defenses. Logs, sandbags, and dirt mounds became as important as rifles and bayonets. What generals once dismissed as cowardice was now necessity. The lesson was written in blood. Men in cover survived. Men in the open died. The earthworks of Petersburg foreshadowed the trenches of the Western Front in World War I. The resemblance is striking. Long fortified lines, static positions, battles decided by artillery barrages rather than movement. The Civil War, intended by many to be a quick and glorious affair, had become a brutal laboratory for the warfare of the future. But even amid this grim transformation, innovation continued. The war had not yet exhausted its horrors, for a new weapon was about to make its appearance on the battlefield. The Gatling gun, a mechanical harbinger of the machine age. In the muddy fields of Petersburg, alongside the trenches and earthworks, another innovation made its first tentative appearance. The Gatling gun. Invented in 1861 by Richard Jordan Gatling, this crank-operated weapon could fire hundreds of rounds per minute, an astonishing leap forward in firepower compared to the single-shot muskets carried by most soldiers. Gatling himself hoped his creation might actually reduce the slaughter of war, arguing that one man with a Gatling gun could replace dozens with rifles, thereby sparing lives. The battlefield, however, told a different story. Though used only sparingly during the Civil War, the Gatling gun represented the dawning of a new age. At Petersburg, Union forces tested the weapon in limited battles, mowing down Confederate charges with terrifying efficiency. Accounts describe its barrels spinning furiously, the chatter of bullets unending, and lines of attackers collapsing under a storm of lead. Soldiers who witnessed its use spoke with awe and unease, sensing that something fundamentally new had entered the art of killing. The Gatling gun's true impact would come later in colonial wars and eventually in the trenches of World War I, but its shadow loomed over Petersburg like a prophecy. Here was a machine that embodied the very essence of industrial warfare. Mechanized, relentless, impersonal. No longer was killing the slow work of steady hands and aimed shots. Now it could be done by turning a crank. And yet commanders in the Civil War were slow to embrace it. Many distrusted the new weapon, preferring tried-and-true artillery or mass musket fire. Others considered it too heavy, unreliable, or wasteful of precious ammunition. In a war already plagued by supply shortages, few were eager to add another hungry machine of iron to feed. Still, its appearance marked a turning point. With the Gatling gun, the old dream of glorious charges became even more obsolete. Against its hail of fire, the courage of advancing infantry mattered little. Strategy and bravery could be wiped out in seconds by mechanical efficiency. The war had revealed a terrible truth. Technology was beginning to outweigh valor as the deciding factor in battle. Looking back, the Civil War appears not only as a national struggle over union and freedom, but also as a crossroads in the history of warfare itself. Muskets gave way to rifles, cannons to rifled artillery, and now at Petersburg, hand-loaded volleys to the grinding rhythm of the machine gun's ancestor. The lessons were written plainly in the blood-soaked fields of Virginia, but they would not be fully heeded until half a century later when Europe plunged into the Great War. For the men who fought in the 1860s, however, the Gatling gun was simply another reminder of the war's cruelty, a glimpse of a future they couldn't yet name but which they had already begun to endure. And as the conflict dragged to its weary end, what lingered most wasn't the novelty of new weapons, but the staggering human cost. When the guns finally fell silent in 1865, the United States emerged not triumphant but hollowed out. The numbers themselves are staggering. Over 620,000 dead, a figure that may climb even higher by some modern estimates. This meant nearly 1 in 4 soldiers who marched away to war never returned. In a nation of just over 31 million people, the loss represented roughly 8% of the entire male population. A wound that touched every farm, every town, every church pew. The cost wasn't evenly shared. In some communities, whole companies of men had enlisted together, neighbors and cousins filling the ranks side by side. When those regiments were cut down, the hometowns they left behind became places of silence. A single afternoon's fighting could erase a generation of brothers and friends from a single county. Letters from mothers and widows filled with grief reveal the war's true battlefield. The empty kitchen tables and untended fields of the home front. The sight of maimed veterans was a constant reminder of the price paid. Amputees crowded railway platforms, their crutches thumping against wooden boards, their uniforms ragged. They returned to farms where plows now seemed impossibly heavy, to shops where work they once performed with ease was now out of reach. Yet many endured with remarkable strength, shaping the first American veterans' culture, forming groups that would demand recognition and support long after the war. Cemeteries, too, became new landscapes of mourning. Fields that once grew crops now held rows of headstones. Families traveled miles to find the graves of their sons, only to discover them in rows of the unnamed, marked simply as unknown U.S. soldier. The scale of burial was unprecedented. Entire sections of land were set aside as national cemeteries. Gettysburg itself became not only a battlefield but a shrine to the fallen. The impact on population was profound. With so many young men lost, marriage rates shifted, widows outnumbered eligible bachelors, and communities adjusted to a future forever changed. Some southern counties wouldn't recover their pre-war male population for decades. In the North, factories found themselves staffed increasingly by women, immigrants, and the very veterans who could no longer work the land. Even the nation's spirit bore scars. Writers of the post-war generation often described a sense of sadness hanging over American life. The war had resolved great political questions. Union preserved, slavery abolished, but it had left behind a society haunted by absence. For those who survived, the memory of the war wasn't one of clean victories but of endless funerals. The Civil War wasn't only the deadliest conflict in American history. It was also the most intimate. No family was untouched. No community was spared. And as the United States looked toward rebuilding, it carried with it the sobering knowledge that the price of unity had been a generation itself. In the years that followed Appomattox, the Civil War refused to fade. Its shadows stretched far beyond the graves and amputee wards. It reshaped how Americans thought about war, death, and memory itself. For the first time in U.S. history, the nation had to deal with loss on a factory-like scale, and it turned to ritual, symbols, and shared remembrance to endure. Cemeteries became sacred ground. Arlington, once the estate of Robert E. Lee, was transformed into a national cemetery, a deliberate act of both practicality and symbolism. Across the North and South, smaller cemeteries filled with rows of identical headstones, creating landscapes of mourning that forced Americans to confront the cost of the Union's survival. To walk among them was to see absence given physical form. From this grief emerged new traditions. Soldiers' graves were decorated with flowers each spring, ceremonies that evolved into Memorial Day. What began as local acts of remembrance, widows placing wreaths, children scattering petals, grew into a national ritual. In these gestures lay both mourning and meaning, a way to honor sacrifice but also to give structure to grief too vast for words. The veterans themselves carried the war in their bodies and minds. Groups like the Grand Army of the Republic in the North and the United Confederate Veterans in the South gave them fellowship, political influence, and a voice in shaping how the war would be remembered. They marched in parades, raised monuments, and passed down stories that hardened into legend. Their presence kept the memory of battle alive for generations who had never seen the smoke of a battlefield. But memory was never neutral. In the South, the lost cause narrative emerged, recasting defeat as noble tragedy and obscuring slavery as the war's central cause. In the North, veterans framed the Union victory as proof of the Republic's endurance and divine favor. Between these competing memories, the true human cost often receded, overshadowed by myth-making. Yet for families with empty chairs at the table, the cost never needed embellishment. It was carved into their daily lives. The Civil War also changed the very idea of citizenship. Freedmen's cemeteries bore witness to the price African American soldiers paid in the struggle for freedom. Their graves were silent proof that freedom wasn't given but earned in blood. The service of black soldiers forced a reckoning with what it meant to be an American, though the promises of equality would remain contested for decades to come. Above all, the war taught that technology and modern industry had forever changed the nature of battle. Rifled muskets, artillery barrages, earthworks, and even the early rumble of mechanized firepower had revealed that the age of heroic charges was over. Generals in Europe studied these lessons closely. When the Great War erupted in 1914, Echoes of Antietam and Petersburg could be heard in the trenches of the Somme and Verdun. The Civil War's shadow was long indeed. It lay across America's cemeteries and battlefields, across its politics and memory, across its sense of itself. The war had ended, but its consequences lingered, reminding every generation that the cost of disunion and of clinging to the past in an age of change was measured not only in ideals but in lives. The American Civil War stands as both a tragedy and a turning point, a war that consumed a generation while reshaping the future of the nation. Its cost was staggering. Hundreds of thousands dead, communities hollowed out, a society draped in mourning. Yet its legacy reached far beyond the graves. It forced Americans to confront the reality of industrialized killing, to acknowledge that courage and sacrifice couldn't overcome the deadly precision of modern weapons. The conflict preserved the Union and ended slavery, but it also left behind scars, physical, emotional, and cultural, that would endure for decades. Veterans limped through town squares as living reminders of sacrifice. Widows and orphans carried grief into the next century. Cemeteries became national monuments to both unity and loss. And each spring, flowers placed on soldiers' graves reminded Americans of the fragile line between memory and forgetting. Militarily, the Civil War foreshadowed the wars to come. Trenches, rifled artillery, and the tentative horror of the Gatling gun pointed toward a new era where technology would dominate the battlefield. The lessons written in blood at Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Gettysburg would be studied by European officers who later dug their own networks of trenches in World War I. What seemed uniquely American in the 1860s would prove to be a grim preview of global conflict. Culturally, the war's memory split the nation even as it sought to heal. In the North, victory was framed as proof of democratic endurance. In the South, the Lost Cause narrative reshaped defeat into a story of honor, defiance, and tragedy. Between them lay the unspoken truth. The war had been about slavery, freedom, and the future of the Republic. And though freedom was won on paper, the struggle for equality was only beginning. Yet through all its pain, the Civil War remains a defining moment in American identity. It revealed the nation's capacity for both destruction and renewal, for division and reconciliation. It was a crucible in which the United States was tested not only as a military power but as an idea. The price was almost unbearable, but out of the ashes emerged a country that could no longer pretend its future was anything but bound together. Today, when we stand at Gettysburg or Antietam, or walk among the rows of white headstones at Arlington, we hear echoes of that cost. The silence of those fields is louder than any cannon, reminding us that the Civil War wasn't just history. It was lived experience paid for in blood. It remains the deadliest conflict in American history, a warning and a legacy all at once. And perhaps the most haunting truth of all is this. The Civil War revealed not only how fragile the American experiment was, but also how determined it was to endure.